The wind scraped its knuckles along the cabin boards until the whole room shivered. Clara Wren woke to the rasp of it and the small, even breaths of the boy beside the hearth. The fire had fallen into a sullen red eye. The rest of the ash lay gray and cold. She pulled her shawl close and sat up, waiting for her head to quit its ringing. The coal did that, clanged inside a person like a bell. "Eli," she whispered. He stirred beneath the patched quilt, all elbows and knees and trust. The quilt had been a dress once. She could still see the faded blue flowers in the lamplight when she tilted the wick. The fuel in that lamp would be gone by nightfall, and she would not replace it. She would not replace anything. Not after this morning. There was nothing left to replace with. She crossed to the table and lifted the lid on the tin where she kept her flour. Her father had called flour a steady friend. It forgave clumsy hands. It gave good gifts under heat and time. She tilted the tin and listened to the soft hiss of the last dust sliding to the corner. Not nothing. Not yet. She touched it with her fingers as one might touch a soft cheek, and then she smiled at herself for the foolishness of it. Eli sat up and pushed hair from his eyes. He watched her the way he always did, careful, solemn, waiting for the shape of the day to form on her face. "Morning," he said, and his voice made an earnest little scratch in the quiet. "Morning," she answered, gentle. "Come warm your hands." He scooted closer to the hearth, and she tucked the quilt around his legs. She broke a heel from the hard crust that had been last night's bread and pressed it into his hand. He tried to hand it back. She closed his fingers over it and tipped her chin toward his mouth. He obeyed, chewing slowly, eyes on her. She pretended not to notice his attention and reached for the water bucket. Thin ice cracked under the dipper. "We'll have proper bread," she said, as if the words could make it. "One more loaf." She set to work. Her father had taught her to measure by feel, not by cup. He taught her to let the dough tell her what it wanted. She sifted the last of the flour into the bowl and sprinkled in salt from a stubby twist of paper. The yeast, saved like treasure, waited in a wrapped scrap beneath the tin. She opened it and breathed in faint life. It would do. She added water and stirred with a wooden spoon until the dough gathered, sluggish but willing, then tipped it onto the table and worked it with the heel of her palm. The cabin filled up with the soft rhythm of it. Push, fold, turn, like saying a prayer you half remember and wholly need. Eli watched, bread heel forgotten in his hand. She lifted the dough and felt its weight. Not enough to feed a man with long days and strong arms, but enough to quiet the sound of an empty house. Enough to trade. Enough, if God was kind, to buy a bottle of willow tincture for Eli's cough and a paper of pins for mending and perhaps, if she smiled as though she had something bright to hide, 2 pennies more. She shaped the round and slipped it into the dented pan. She set the oven door and fed the last 2 sticks to the stove. The fire liked the sticks, accepted them, held out its hands. When she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend the cabin had the look of plenty. She could almost see the old bakery windows curtained and clouded with steam, and the way the town children fussed at the counter to be allowed 1 honey drop each. "Just 1, Miss Wren, please." She could see her father bent over the bench, flour tucked into the seams of his knuckles and the corner of his smile. She reached into the drawer and found it where she always kept it, the little brass stamp with the stylized W, edges smoothed by years of use. The stamp was not valuable to anyone but her. It was all that remained of a name that had once floated a family. She dipped the face of the stamp into a dusting of flour and pressed it gently into the center of the risen dough. When she lifted it, the W shone pale and clean in the rounded top, a small assertion. This was ours. We were here. "May I?" Eli asked. "Someday," she said, "when your hands are stronger." He puffed out a breath at that, affronted and hopeful all at once. The smell came slowly, then all at once. The sweet, clean scent of baking, of life becoming more than the sum of its parts. It made her throat ache. She lifted the lid and peered into the oven as if the loaf were a baby she'd set down for a moment. Golden, imperfect, soft as forgiveness, her father used to say. There were seams where there should not be seams. The crust blistered in 2 places. She did not care. It was a miracle. She turned it out onto the board and tapped the underside with her fingernails. The hollow sound told her it was done. She set it on the windowsill for the cold to pull the steam out and listened to the faint crackle of the crust cooling. The whole cabin smelled like memory. Eli reached for it, then stopped himself and tucked his hands under his thighs. She laughed around the ache. "We're taking this to town," she said. "We'll trade fair. You'll keep close and you'll mind." He nodded. He coughed into his sleeve and ducked his head so she wouldn't see, which meant he knew she would worry. She kissed his hair. It smelled of smoke and boy. She wrapped the loaf in a clean scrap of muslin and tied it with twine. The W faced up, neat as a promise. She pulled on her boots. The leather cracked deep at the bend of her toes and wound her shawl tight. The air bit at her eyes when she opened the door. The world outside lay in that peculiar blue light winter keeps for itself, the snow patchy where the grass fought it and the tall cottonwoods drawing black lines on the pale sky. They walked the road to Red Hollow with the wind at their backs, which was mercy. The road knew her feet. It knew when she walked in grief, and when she walked in fear, and when she marched with the stiff-necked pride of someone who refuses to be turned back. Today she walked with all three. Eli slipped his small hand into hers and blinked against the cold. As they passed the Miller farm, she kept her gaze on the road and pretended not to see the curtains twitch. It was a 20-minute walk if you were not hungry and not discussed. Today it took longer. Two men riding in from the east slowed to look. One touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, neutral. The other gave a narrow smile. "Mornin', Miss Wren," he said, and he made Miss sound like a word that had done a wrong thing. "Mornin'," she answered, and she did not slow. Eli pressed closer. They crossed the creek, water black and narrow between ice-rimmed banks. She let Eli hop from stone to stone to make it feel like a game. On the other side, Red Hollow lifted a shoulder against the sky. The saloon with its peeling paint and bright doors, the mercantile, the blacksmith with smoke licking out, and near the center, the sheriff's office with the flag gone a little gray from the wind. She had planned the mercantile first. She had practiced in her mind the manner she would use at Mr. Finch's counter. Humble but not begging, grateful but not obsequious, as though she had some cushion against desperation. She had planned to let the loaf do the talking. But the wind changed, sly and sharp, and the sheriff's office door banged open, and a man stepped out with a sheaf of papers in his hand. He was taller than most. He wore his badge without fuss, the way a man wears a well-made boot. He glanced up from the papers to see where the door had jumped to, and his eyes, in that small, ordinary movement, found hers. They were a gray that might sometimes be blue. What she noticed first was not the color, but the steadiness. So many of the eyes in Red Hollow skittered away from her, or else latched on like burrs, curious and unkind. His held still, not pressing, not retreating. She did not like what it did to the back of her throat. "Afternoon," he said out of habit, then seemed to remember the cold sun was still rising. "Morning." "Sheriff," she said, and she had meant to keep walking, but her feet faltered, because she always told the truth even when no one would thank her for it. She looked at the sign above his door as if it were a certainty she could lean on. Sheriff James Alder. She knew the name the way one knows the names of hills or storms. He had been kind to a ranch hand once when the man's horse came up lame in front of the saloon. He had refused a drink when the whole town wanted to raise one to the 4th of July. He had been a husband. He was a widower now. People said the fever had taken her quick. He dipped his head toward Eli. "You keeping your mother out of trouble, son?" Eli looked up at Clara, uncertain. She felt, as she always did, the slip of the word mother across her skin. She did not correct him. Eli squeezed her fingers. "We're here to trade," she said, and lifted the loaf a little, as if that declared her purpose like a passport might in a kinder country. "Mercantile opens late," he said. "Finch had a quinsy last week. Leaves him slow." He stepped back from his doorway. "You can wait in here if you like. Fire's decent." She ought to have said no. She knew better than to step into rooms where men did their measuring. But Eli had begun to cough again, and the word fire had the pull of a church bell. She nodded once. The office smelled of wood smoke and clean paper. A map of the county hung behind the desk, bristling with pins. There was a pot-bellied stove and a tin pot on it. The heat reached for Eli and pressed its palms to his cheeks. The boy smiled despite himself. Clara stood straight and tucked her loaf into the crook of her arm. "Tea?" Alder asked. He did not move until she nodded. Then he poured 2 tin cups and set one on the desk for her. He set the other in Eli's hands as if he were placing it on a ledge, careful not to drop it, as if Eli himself were a ledge that could not afford a crack. "Thank you," Clara said, and the steam feathered her face. "You're Clara Wren," he said, not a question. And then, "I knew your father." Her head lifted at that. "Everyone knew my father. Some men for the price of his bread," he said. "Some men for the way he gave it." The room was too quiet. The wind outside pawed at the eaves. She could feel the loaf cooling under its cloth, the shape of it against her ribs like a second heart. Alder stepped around the desk and leaned a hip against it, hands easy at his sides. He was not a young man, not an old one, somewhere in the middle where strength has learned to sit down in a chair and think before it moves, and lines at the corners of his eyes that looked, to her surprise, like kindness running to ground there. "What will you be trading for?" he asked. "Medicine," she said. "Pins, thread, if Mr. Finch can be persuaded." He nodded, as if that matched a list he had expected. His gaze dropped to the loaf in its muslin. She knew then. He had seen the faint circle of the stamp through the cloth. When he looked back up, his expression had changed. Not hard, not soft. Attentive in a way that felt like standing near a cliff and finding the view below you is river, not rocks. "May I?" He lifted a hand and let it stop halfway to the loaf, waiting. She untied the twine and folded the cloth aside. The W sat clean and pale at the crown. For an instant the office seemed to press in, as if history were crowding close to see. He exhaled. It was a small sound, but it cut. "That mark," he said. "I haven't seen it in a while." "It is mine to use," she said, the words too quick. "He would have wanted me to." "I don't dispute that." He took a breath and steadied it. "I've been looking at that W almost every night. In a different place." He turned and set his cup down. "I have a file," he said, and the word file made her fingers go cold despite the stove. "From 3 months back. Stagecoach job north of the cut. 1 man ran. 1 man bled. He bled near your road. There was bread in that file. A heel of it. Your mark." He did not look away. "I've been trying to find the person who baked it." She heard the scrape of the wind and the tiny hiss of the stove. Eli's cup made a soft click as he set it carefully on the floor and looked at her. A mother, a not mother, a woman who had been at the right place the wrong night with flour on her hands and a habit of mercy. She had thought her silence would be a coat good enough to wear through winter. It had not occurred to her that someone would come seeking warmth with questions. "I didn't know," she said, and her voice stayed low and level by pure muscle. "When he knocked, I didn't know what he'd done. I only saw the blood." "I believe you," Alder said before she could say more. He said it as if the belief lay ready on his tongue. "Clara!" The way he said her name put weight in the room, like someone laying a quilt over a sleeping child. "I believe you." He could have asked for the rest of it then. He could have pressed her. He did not. The quiet turned into an animal that wanted to be fed. She fed it, because she had learned that some silences, if not given food, would come eat at you. "He died," she said. "He asked me to tell someone he was sorry. He did not say for what. He said he had not expected the bread to taste like a church prayer." She almost smiled. It hurt. He was a poor judge of poetry. Alder's mouth moved, a not smile, a grief slam that shifted and settled. He nodded as if he had known the shape of her answer before she gave it. He watched her with a care that felt like a hand beneath a glass pitcher. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I'm not going to take anything from you that you need to live." It should not have moved her. Words were cheap in Red Hollow, but there was something unadorned in the way he said it that made the inside of her ribs unfurl. She hated that. She took a breath and folded the muslin back over the bread, covering the W as if she could erase the last minute and stitch her morning into another life. "We should go," she said. "Mr. Finch will be awake." Alder did not block the door. He did not ask more questions. He reached for his coat from the peg and shrugged into it. "You don't have to," she began. "Mercantile man likes company when he's got the quinsy," he said mildly. "I'll see you there." Outside, the wind reared and shoved its shoulder at them again. Red Hollow went about its day with that meager Western determination that looks like indifference from a distance. Miss O'Donnell leaned in her saloon doorway, hair pinned high like a flame, watching. The blacksmith hammered to make warmth, not horseshoes. Clara kept her eyes on the mercantile's door and counted steps the way a person counts stitches. 1, 2, 3. Stay even. Don't let it pull. Inside, Mr. Finch blinked at them from behind the counter, his jaw wrapped in a flannel band. He looked like a man who had just swallowed a mouse whole and was pretending otherwise. He nodded to the sheriff and then to Clara, less a greeting than an acknowledgement that they had entered the sphere of his inventory. "What can I do for the law?" he mumbled then to Clara. "What can I do?" She set the loaf on the counter and untied it. The smell rose and softened the angles of the room. Mr. Finch's eyes made the quick calculations of a merchant and a man who grew up with a mother's hands. He reached as if to touch, then thought better of it, and rubbed his knuckles instead. "Good bake," he said grudgingly, "even with winter yeast." "Medicine," Clara said. "Willow tincture if you have it. And pins. Thread." "Pins are dear," Finch said, but he had already turned to fetch them. He plucked at the shelves, set down a bottle, a little paper packet, a spool of white thread. "Can't give you all of it for one loaf." "I didn't come to take," Clara said evenly, "just to trade fair." Alder leaned at the end of the counter, saying nothing. Finch eyed the sheriff, then the bread again, then Clara. He named a price that did not insult her but did not comfort her either. It would empty her pockets of the last 2 coins she had kept in a china thimble under the loose floorboard. She reached into her shawl and set them down, one by one, as if they were something living that might scuttle away. Finch scooped them with satisfaction. He wrapped the bottle and the pins in brown paper and tied it in twine. "You're paid up," he said. "And there's a thing on account of the taste of that loaf." He reached under the counter and added a small cone of sugar. "Call it a mercy." She nodded because she could not speak around the sudden hard swell in her throat. Eli touched the sugar cone with a reverence that made Finch look away as if he'd done something indecent by giving it. "Thank you," she managed. She gathered the parcel. She tied the muslin back over the bread because there were still small trades to make, a bit of lard from Mrs. Amos, perhaps a handful of beans from the preacher's wife if she asked in the right voice. She turned to go. Alder's shadow tipped across the floorboards as he shifted. Then he said it, the words quiet and clean in the space between the counter and the door, as if he were setting a nail and bringing the hammer down once. "True. You're the one I've been searching for." The room seemed to tilt. Mr. Finch made a noise like a hinge. Clara felt the smallest parts of herself seize and hold. He had said it without triumph, without accusation, but as a man might speak when he finally matches a face to the outline drawn in his head. She looked at him and said nothing because nothing would come that was not too much. She inclined her head, quicker than a nod, the way you acknowledge a horse that could run you down but hasn't. "Good day, Sheriff," she said. "Good day, Mr. Finch." She reached for Eli's hand and they stepped into the cold. The wind grabbed the door from her grip and slammed it back against the jamb with a bang that started a dog 3 stores down. The sound ran along Main Street and up into the bare windows where ladies in winter shawls stood discussing and men in work coats leaned and looked. She did not turn. She felt the weight of Alder's gaze at her back, the way one feels the sun when it comes out from behind a cloud. Not heat exactly, not yet, but the certainty of it. They walked. And the world was as it had been. The sky winter pale, the cottonwoods black, the creek making its thin music. Eli held her parcel against his chest like a small, furious bird he meant to keep warm. She drew her shawl closer and did not look behind her. Only once, at the edge of town, she caught, in the ripple of glass in the apothecary window, the reflection of a tall man stepping out into the street, the set of his shoulders careful, as if he'd just decided on something that would matter. She did not know what he had decided. She knew only that a sentence had been spoken in a warm office that smelled of paper and stove iron, and that it had opened a door inside her as deftly as a key. She would close it. She would lock it, because she had learned to keep her house against weather. The day dragged its long light across the snow, and she walked toward the cabin that held her small store of firewood and her single iron skillet, and a boy who had trusted her before he had words for trusting. She walked with her chin tucked and her grip on Eli's shore. Behind her, the town breathed and went on. Somewhere in that breathing, a man watched her go and saw something rare in her eyes. The wind rose. The road bent. She did not bend with it. She went home with medicine and thread and a sugar cone and the last loaf cooling under cloth, and she told herself it was enough. The day after the trade, Red Hollow woke under a lid of low gray clouds that promised snow. Clara Wren stood at the cabin window, watching her breath fog the glass. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of old wood and smoke. Eli slept near the hearth, his hand resting against the sugar cone, as if guarding proof that kindness still existed in the world. Clara should have felt relief. She had medicine, thread, a few pins tucked neatly in her sewing tin. But the words spoken in the sheriff's office lingered in her chest, clinging like burrs. "You're the one I've been searching for." She had gone over them in her mind 100 ways. She could not tell if they were meant as accusation or salvation. The look in Sheriff Alder's eyes had not been harsh. It had been searching. And that frightened her more than anger ever could. The wind rattled the cabin door, and she turned back to the fire. The bread she had traded sat reduced to its last quarter loaf. She tore a small piece for herself and a larger one for Eli when he woke. Then she wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside to split more wood. The axe bit into the stump, clean and quick. Each strike echoed through the quiet, bouncing off the far hills. The sound steadied her. It reminded her that she still owned something that could not be taken. Her hands, her will, her breath. A crunch of boots behind her made her stop mid-swing. She turned sharply, heart-jumping, only to find the sheriff standing near the fence, hat in hand. "Morning, Miss Wren," he said. His tone was mild, cautious, as if he knew how easy it was to startle a sparrow. Clara straightened, brushing wood dust from her sleeves. "Sheriff Alder, you've a habit of appearing where folks least expect you." "I'd say the same for you," he replied, nodding toward the small clearing around her cabin. "Not many live out this far from town. Hard place to make a living." "It's quiet," she said. "Quiet suits me." He smiled faintly, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I imagine it does." For a moment, the silence between them stretched. Only the wind moved, sighing through the bare branches. Then Alder stepped closer, holding out a small sack. "Brought this from Finch's. He said the flour he gave you last time was old. This one's better milled. Consider it a replacement, not charity." Clara hesitated, hands still at her sides. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not," he said, "but I wanted to." She took the sack carefully. The weight of it felt almost wrong in her hands, too generous for something freely given. "I can pay you back when I've something to trade." "Didn't bring it for payment." "Then why?" His gaze flickered toward Eli's sleeping form visible through the cabin window. "Because it's cold, and I know what it's like to wake to an empty shelf." Clara looked down, the handle of the axe still caught loosely in her hand. "You've no need to pity me, Sheriff. I've managed this long without it." "I don't pity you, Miss Wren," he said softly. "I respect you." The words landed heavy, unexpected. Clara swallowed and turned away, pretending to adjust the kindling by the stump. Respect was rarer than gold in Red Hollow. It was not something she knew how to hold. Alder glanced toward the horizon, where the line of the town blurred into mist. "Mind if I fix that gate for you?" he asked. "Looks like the latch's been giving trouble." She almost refused. But the wind tugged at her skirt, and the thought of his offer, so plainly spoken, felt more like neighborliness than intrusion. She nodded once. "If you like." He set to work without waiting for thanks. Clara watched from the porch as he removed the loose hinge. replaced the nail, and reset the bar with the quiet precision of a man used to mending things others forgot to care for. His hands were rough, his movements sure, and she found herself studying the line of his shoulders, the calm patience in the way he worked. When the gate swung closed with a clean click, he dusted his palms and turned toward her. "There," he said simply, "won't rattle so loud now." "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded, tipping his hat. "If you ever need help with repairs, you can leave word at the office, or send Eli. I don't aim to trouble the law with household matters." "You wouldn't be troubling me," his voice gentled. "Sometimes a man needs a reason to ride out this way. Gives him a bit of quiet, too." She didn't answer that, and he didn't press her. He lingered only a moment longer before heading down the path, the sound of his boots crunching over frost until it faded into the hush of the woods. When he was gone, Clara stood by the fence for a long time, staring at the fixed gate. The small things, she thought, were the ones that broke a person. Small kindnesses, small memories, small mercies you weren't sure you deserved. That night she dreamed of her father's bakery. She dreamed of the smell of yeast and honey and the steady rhythm of his laughter. But when she turned to see him, the man standing at the oven was not her father. It was the sheriff, and he was looking at her as though he'd known her long before she'd ever come to Red Hollow. She woke with her heart pounding, her face damp with tears. Days turned into weeks. Snow began to gather along the ridges, pale and unbroken. Clara mended clothes by the fire and baked what she could. Sometimes she caught sight of Sheriff Alder riding the northern road, his coat dark against the white hills. Once he stopped to leave a small bundle at her gate, a tin of coffee, half a jar of molasses, a note that simply read, "For the boy." She never thanked him, but she kept the note folded in her apron pocket, worn at the edges from her fingers tracing the letters. One morning, a knock rattled her door. She froze, needle still in hand. Few people came calling here. She opened it cautiously and found Deputy Miller on the stoop, hat in hand, grin slick with the kind of charm that curdled quick. "Morning, Miss Wren," he said, eyes sliding past her into the cabin. "Sheriff sent me to check the ridge. Mind if I water my horse at your well?" She stepped aside. "The well's down past the shed." He nodded but lingered, his gaze settling on the small loaf cooling by the hearth. "You've been baking again." "I have." "Good smell," he said and smiled too wide. "Folks still talking about that bread you traded at Finch's. Haven't tasted better since your pa passed." She felt her stomach tighten. "Rumors travel fast in Red Hollow. Faster than goodwill." He chuckled. "Ain't a crime to bake good bread." His tone shifted, sly. "But there's talk about that outlaw you helped. Some say the sheriff's gone soft on you. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Clara's jaw stiffened. "If you've nothing useful to say, Deputy, I'd be obliged if you took your water and went." His grin faltered at her tone. "Just asking a friendly question." "I've no friendly answers." For a moment his eyes hardened, but then he tipped his hat and turned toward the shed. The sound of his horse drinking filled the silence. When he mounted again, he said, "Careful, Miss Wren. Folks watch who the sheriff visits." She closed the door without reply. That evening, as the light waned, she heard hooves again, but this time the rhythm was different, slower, deliberate. When she opened the door, Alder sat astride his horse, face shadowed beneath his brim. "Did my deputy trouble you?" he asked quietly. Clara folded her arms. He asked questions. "I gave none back. I'll have a word with him." "You don't need to fight my battles, Sheriff." "Maybe not," he said, "but I don't like my men speaking where they shouldn't." He dismounted, looping the reins over the post. "I thought I'd ride by, make sure you were all right." She gave a small, weary smile. "Do you check on every soul in Red Hollow this way?" "Only the ones the town talks about too much." That drew a reluctant laugh from her. Soft, almost shy. He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken moved between them. Inside, the fire crackled low. She offered him tea, and he accepted. They sat opposite each other, the lamplight bending around their faces. Eli dozed in the corner, his breathing steady. "You were married once," Clara said, breaking the quiet. Alder nodded, eyes lowering. 8 years ago. Fever took her quick, took our child too. I'm sorry. He nodded again, but his voice was steady. You lose enough, you start counting days by what you still have. For a long while, I thought I'd already run out of that. She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. And now? Now I'm not sure, he said, looking up. You remind me there's still something worth finding. The words pressed into her chest like a slow, steady heartbeat. She looked away, not trusting her voice. When he finally stood to leave, he paused by the door. You told me once you baked one final loaf. Don't let it be your last. She met his gaze. Bread takes flour, Sheriff, and hope. I can bring flour, he said quietly. You just keep the hope. After he left, the cabin felt both emptier and warmer. She sat by the window, watching the dark swallow his figure down the road. The snow began to fall, thin at first, then thicker, softening the world into silence. Over the next few days, his visits continued. Sometimes he came with supplies, sometimes only with conversation. They spoke of small things, weather, crops, the new preacher in town. But beneath their words ran something quieter, deeper, like water moving under ice. One evening, as the sky turned pink above the pines, Clara stood outside, hanging Eli's washed clothes on the line. Alder rode up the hill, his coat dusted with frost. He dismounted and leaned against the fence, watching her. You work too hard, he said. She smiled faintly. If I stop, the cold will catch me. He stepped closer. You shouldn't have to fight it alone. She turned, meeting his gaze squarely. I've been alone longer than I can remember. It doesn't frighten me. Doesn't mean you like it. The silence stretched, thick and fragile. Her heart thudded loud enough she thought he might hear it. Then Eli called from inside, breaking the moment. Clara turned quickly, pretending to adjust the line. When she looked back, Alder had taken a step back, hands folded on the fence rail. Good night, Miss Wren. Good night, Sheriff. She watched him ride away until the last sound of his horse faded into the hills. That night, the wind rose again, carrying with it a sense of something shifting. Clara sat awake long after Eli had fallen asleep, staring into the low fire. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond survival, a morning that began not with fear, but with warmth. But Red Hollow had never been kind to dreamers, and as she drifted into uneasy sleep, a shadow moved along the far ridge, a rider pausing to watch the small cabin light before vanishing into the dark. The storm that would change everything was coming, and neither Clara Wren nor Sheriff James Alder yet knew that the fragile thread pulling them together would soon be tested by the weight of the past. Snow fell in soft spirals over Red Hollow, muting every sound until even the wind seemed to walk in its bare feet. Clara Wren stood by the window of her cabin, the glass rimmed in frost, watching the flakes settle on the fence Sheriff Alder had mended. Each one landed and disappeared, like a promise made too gently to last. It had been 4 days since she'd last seen him. 4 days since that moment by the clothesline, when something unspoken had pulsed between them and then gone quiet again. She told herself she didn't care, that she had bread to bake and wood to split and a child to keep fed. But every time the wind brushed against the cabin, she found herself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see his dark coat moving through the white. Eli hummed to himself by the hearth, shaping little figures out of leftover dough scraps. He pressed them flat and set them near the stove, proud of his makeshift soldiers. His cheeks were pink from the heat. When he laughed, the sound filled the small room and made it feel less like loneliness and more like home. Clara smiled faintly. Careful not to burn them or they'll come to life angry. Eli grinned. Then we'll make more. Outside, the snow deepened. By midday, the light had gone strange, thick and gray, the kind that made the horizon vanish. Clara wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped outside to bring in more wood. The cold bit her fingers raw. As she lifted the last log, the faint sound of hooves reached her ears. At first she thought it might be the sheriff, but as the figure drew closer, her heart sank. It wasn't Alder. It was Deputy Miller. He reined in near the fence, face shadowed under his hat, and offered her a thin smile. "Afternoon, Miss Wren. Mighty cold day for chopping wood." She didn't return the smile. "Afternoon, Deputy. What brings you up this way again?" "Sheriff's out checking the southern ridge. Asked me to make my rounds." His eyes flicked to the cabin, then back to her. "You've had a lot of company lately. Folks are starting to talk." "Let them," she said evenly. He tilted his head. "You don't care what they say?" "I learned long ago that caring won't change their minds." Miller chuckled. "Maybe, but the sheriff's been sticking his neck out for you. People notice that sort of thing. Some don't like it." Clara's hands tightened on the log. "If you have a message from him, say it. Otherwise, I've work to do." He leaned forward in his saddle, voice dropping. "You might want to watch yourself. There's still folks who think you helped that outlaw. They're saying the sheriff's protecting you for reasons that ain't law." Her cheeks burned despite the cold. "You'd best be careful, Deputy. Rumors like that can kill a good man faster than a bullet." He smiled, thin and mean. "That's the truth of it." Then he tugged the reins and rode off, his laughter trailing behind like smoke. Clara stood there long after he was gone, her pulse thudding hard. She knew how easily whispers could turn into danger. She'd seen it before, how one false story could ruin a life. She pressed her hands to her face and breathed deep until the shaking stopped. By dusk, the snow had thickened into a curtain. She shut the shutters and added another log to the fire. Eli slept early, curled beneath his blanket, one arm thrown across his stuffed cloth horse. The cabin creaked softly under the weight of the storm. Clara sat at the table with her sewing, needle glinting in the lamplight. She tried to keep her thoughts steady, but her mind drifted to the sheriff again, how he'd stood in her doorway that first morning, his voice calm, his eyes patient. There was something about him that steadied the world around him, as if even the wind listened when he spoke. When the knock came, she nearly dropped the needle. 3 hard raps, then silence. She rose slowly, heart hammering. "Who's there?" "It's James Alder." The relief hit her so sharply she had to catch the edge of the table to keep her balance. She opened the door. He stood there in the snow, coat dusted white, his breath fogging in the lantern light. "Evening, Miss Wren," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't." Her voice came softer than she intended. "Come in, before you freeze." He stepped inside, shaking off the snow. His presence filled the small cabin, the quiet strength, the smell of cold air and horse leather. He glanced toward Eli, sleeping near the fire, and lowered his voice. "I heard Miller came by today." She frowned. "You hear everything that happens in this town?" "I try to." His jaw tightened. "He's been stirring talk where it doesn't belong. I'll deal with it." "I can handle a man's words, Sheriff." "You shouldn't have to." He moved closer, his eyes steady on hers. "I don't like the way they've turned your name into a rumor. You've done nothing wrong." Clara looked down at her hands, the calloused fingers, the pale scars from years of baking. "That's never stopped them before." Alder exhaled, slow and heavy. "I know what they say about me, too, that I'm losing my edge, that I'm too soft. Truth is, I stopped caring about gossip when I buried my family. I'll be damned if I let this town chew up another good soul just to feed its boredom." She looked up at him, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Why do you care so much about me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze softened, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "Because every time I look at you, I see someone still fighting when the world told her not to. And I remember what that feels like." The words cracked something open in her chest. She wanted to speak, but all that came was a whisper. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because people will hear." "Let them." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, electric, alive. The fire snapped, throwing shadows that danced across the walls. Clara felt her heartbeat in her throat. She stepped back, needing space, needing breath. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he looked around the small room, the worn table, the patched curtains, the faint smell of bread still in the air. "You've built something out of almost nothing," he said softly. "That takes more strength than most men ever learn." "I built it because I had no choice." "Maybe, but that doesn't make it any less remarkable." Something inside her trembled. For years she had survived by hardening herself, by keeping every kindness at arm's length. But his words reached places she thought had long since gone numb. Outside, the wind howled. Alder glanced toward the window. "The storm's turning fierce. Roads will be impassable soon." "You'd best stay the night then," she said before she could think better of it. He hesitated, as if giving her one last chance to take it back. When she didn't, he nodded. "I'll sleep by the fire." She brought out an extra blanket and spread it near the hearth. Eli stirred but didn't wake. Alder removed his coat, folded it neatly beside him, and sat down. The flicker of firelight played over his face. Tired, lined, but honest. Clara sat opposite him, her hands curled around a mug of tea. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind and the soft crackle of wood. Then, quietly, Alder said, "Do you ever think about leaving Red Hollow?" "Where would I go?" "Anywhere you'd be safe. Anywhere the past can't reach you." She shook her head. "The past always finds you, no matter how far you run." He nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Maybe you're right." The conversation drifted after that. Talk of weather, of crops, of the slow decay of the old mine north of town. Ordinary words, yet every one of them carried warmth. Clara found herself watching his hands as he spoke. The way they moved, strong and careful, like a man who'd learned long ago the weight of restraint. When the fire sank low, she rose to add more wood. He stood too, their movements almost synchronized. For a heartbeat, they were close, close enough that she could feel the heat from him, could smell the faint trace of coffee and gun oil. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" "For letting me in." She met his eyes and felt the pull of something she'd been too afraid to name. "You'd have done the same for me," she said. "Maybe," he answered, voice low, "but it wouldn't have meant the same." The words hung between them. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell, and turned toward the fire. She watched him a moment longer before returning to her chair. The storm outside roared like a living thing. Hours passed. She must have dozed off, because when she woke, the fire had burned down to embers. The sheriff still sat upright, hat tipped forward, eyes closed in light sleep. The glow from the dying fire brushed his face, softening the hard edges. For the first time in years, Clara felt safe. When morning came, the world outside was buried in white. The door was frozen shut, and the air smelled clean, new, untouched. Alder helped her shovel the drift from the threshold. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the snow like spilled silver. He saddled his horse and turned to her, the reins loose in his gloved hands. "I'll come back in a few days, make sure you've got enough supplies." "You don't need to," she said. "I know, but I will anyway." She smiled faintly. "You're a stubborn man, Sheriff." "Only when it matters." He mounted, tipping his hat. For a moment, he looked as if he wanted to say more, then simply said, "Stay warm, Miss Wren." As he rode away, the sound of hooves echoed down the frozen road until it vanished into silence. Clara stood there, watching the horizon long after he disappeared, her breath clouding in the morning light. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether the whispers would fade or sharpen, whether this fragile warmth between them would survive the cold world they lived in. But she knew one thing. When he said her name, something in her heart began to thaw, and in Red Hollow, that was no small miracle. The thaw came early that year. Patches of brown earth showed through the last of the snow, and Red Hollow smelled of mud and wood smoke. Clara Wren woke before sunrise, the air damp with change. She built the fire and mixed the dough for morning bread while Eli still slept, his small hand tucked under his cheek. Outside, the creek that had frozen for months whispered again, thin and secret, as if testing its voice after silence. When she opened the door, a soft wind drifted in, carrying the scent of pine. The world looked newly washed, yet she felt a weight gathering that no season could melt. Sheriff Alder had not come for 3 days. She told herself he was busy with spring duties, tax disputes, ranch quarrels, the restless talk of men who drank too much now that the roads were clear. But beneath that reasoning was worry. sharp and persistent. The last time she'd seen him, he had promised to return once the storm lifted. He kept his word about most things. By mid-morning, the loaf cooled on the sill, golden and cracked. Clara pulled on her shawl and walked with Eli toward town to trade it. The road, rutted from thaw, sucked at their boots. Birds followed them, hopping in the ditch, searching the mud for worms. It almost felt like peace. But as Red Hollow came into view, she saw something in the way people moved. Clusters of men talking low in the street, glances that slid away when she passed. Mrs. Amos, usually kind, turned abruptly into the dress shop doorway. At the well, two ranch hands whispered until one of them spat into the dust. Clara kept walking, chin high. Hen high. She had lived through gossip before. Still, the air felt thicker than rumor. It felt like storm weather. Mr. Finch at the mercantile accepted her loaf without a word. When he handed over the packet of sugar and the small tin of salve she needed, he avoided her eyes. "That'll square us," he muttered. "Something wrong?" she asked. He sighed, uneasy. "Best talk to the sheriff." Then, softer, "There's men saying things again. Best go home before night." She thanked him, though she didn't know for what, and left with Eli's hand tight in hers. As they stepped into the street, the saloon doors banged open. Deputy Miller came out with two locals behind him. He looked flushed, mean from drink. "Well, if it isn't Miss Wren," he drawled, "the good sheriff's favorite charity." Laughter rolled from the men with him. Clara's stomach turned cold. She started to walk past, but Miller stepped into her path. "You seen him lately?" he asked. "Seems he's been busy defending your honor all over town. Man can't do his duty proper with a woman cloudin' his judgment." Eli shrank behind her skirt. Clara met the deputy's eyes. "Step aside." He leaned closer, breath sour. "Or what? You'll bake me a sermon? Folks are tired of your lies, Miss Wren. They want truth, and I reckon I might give it to 'em." Before she could speak, a voice cut through the air, steady, deep, unmistakable. "That'll be enough, Miller." The crowd stilled. Sheriff Alder stood at the end of the street, hat low, coat unbuttoned, hand resting near his holster. His horse's breath plumed white behind him. He walked forward with the slow certainty of a man who had made up his mind. Miller's grin faltered. "Just talkin', Sheriff. Looks more like pickin', a fight." Alder stopped close enough that the deputy had to tilt his head to meet his eyes. "You're relieved of duty. Turn in your badge." The deputy's face flushed red. "You can't." "I just did." Alder's tone stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. He extended his hand, palm up. "The badge." For a moment, Miller looked ready to draw. Then the silence of the watching street pressed in, and he yanked the badge from his chest and threw it into the dust. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All over a woman who ain't worth." The rest died in his throat as Alder's fist connected. The crack of it echoed off the saloon wall. Miller went down hard. The sheriff didn't look at him again. He turned instead to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded, though her voice wouldn't work. He glanced at Eli, who clung to her skirt, wide-eyed. "Take him home," Alder said quietly. "I'll follow soon." She hesitated. "They'll blame you for this." "Let them," he said, and the way he said it carried an end to argument. At the cabin, dusk settled slow and bruised. Clara lit the lamp and tried to keep busy, putting away the sugar, folding Eli's blanket, anything to silence the pounding in her head. The boy ate his supper in silence, watching her with that worried look children wear when they sense what adults won't say. When the knock came, she already knew it was him. She opened the door before he could call out. He stood there, dust on his coat, eyes shadowed from more than the road. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The firelight caught the bruise swelling on his knuckle. She fetched a basin of water, but he shook his head. "It's fine. It's bleeding." "So's half the town's pride," he said, half smiling. Then the smile faded. Word spreading fast. "They'll paint this any way that suits them." "You shouldn't have done it," she whispered. "You've given them reason. They already had reasons. I just took their weapon out of your hands and made it mine." He paced once, then stopped by the window. Outside, wind moved through the pines, low and restless. "There's talk of a meeting at the saloon tonight. Some of the ranchers want me gone. They think I've lost the law's respect." She set the basin down hard enough that water sloshed over her fingers. "Because you defended me. Because I care," he said simply. The words stole her breath. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The sound of the fire filled the space between them. Then she crossed the room, took his hand, and washed the cut with careful motions. He didn't pull away. When she finished, his fingers caught hers. Light, but certain. "Clara," he said, her name rough in his mouth. "Tell me the truth. The night that outlaw came to your door, was there anything he said, anything that might matter still?" She hesitated. "He said someone in town had betrayed him. A man who promised him safe passage. He never gave a name." Alder's jaw tightened. "Miller. It must be. He was deputy then, working both sides for money." Clara looked up sharply. "If that's true, he won't let you walk away unpunished." "I don't plan to walk." His voice went low, deliberate. "Tomorrow I'll take it before the judge. Miller will answer for it." She shook her head. "He'll come first. You know he will. I'm counting on it." Later, after Eli had fallen asleep, Alder sat near the door cleaning his revolver. The rhythmic click of metal on cloth steadied the night. Clara watched him from the hearth, the light tracing his profile. Tired eyes, the scar along his jaw, the patience of a man who has been both protector and ghost. "You can't stay here," she said at last. "If they come—" "I told you before," he interrupted gently. "You shouldn't have to fight alone." She wanted to argue, but the words broke apart before they left her throat. She turned away, staring into the fire. Outside, a horse neighed somewhere down the slope, then another answered. Alder stood, listening. "They're coming." The first shot shattered the quiet, punching a hole through the night. Alder pushed her toward the hearth. "Down!" He doused the lamp and moved to the window. 3 shapes moved through the dark, torches bobbing. The voices carried, angry, slurred. "Bring her out," someone shouted. "We'll see if she still looks holy with the truth on her tongue." Alder cocked the rifle. "Stay behind the stove. Keep Eli low." The torches came closer, their light crawling along the fence. "Alder!" Miller's voice rang out, ugly with drink and pride. "You hiding her? Come trade your badge for the woman's virtue." The sheriff fired once into the air. The sound tore the night wide open. "That's far enough." Silence, then rough laughter. "You wouldn't shoot neighbors." "Try me," Alder called back. The torches wavered. One man dropped his light and ran. The other 2 held their ground until Miller cursed and swung up his pistol. The flash lit his face, a smear of rage, and then Alder's rifle roared. Miller's shot went wild. The sheriff's didn't. The deputy spun backward into the snow, the torch rolling from his hand and dying in slush. The other men fled. The sudden quiet rang louder than the gunfire had. Alder stepped outside, checked the fallen deputy, then came back in. "He's alive," he said grimly, "but that's done it. They'll come for me at dawn." Clara gripped the edge of the table. "Then go. Ride out tonight." He looked at her, eyes fierce and tender all at once. "And leave you to face them alone? I've survived worse." "I don't doubt that," he said. "But I won't run from truth, and I won't leave you." He sat heavily by the fire, and for the first time she saw weariness in him, deep, bone-tired honesty. She knelt beside him, hands trembling. "James," she whispered, tasting his name for the first time, "they'll destroy you." He looked at her then, the lines at his eyes deepening into something like peace. "Then let them. I've been half dead for years. Tonight, I feel alive." Before she could answer, he pulled her into his arms. The world outside held its breath. Her face found the hollow beneath his collarbone, and for one quiet, stolen moment, everything in her life that had been hard or lonely ceased to exist. When they parted, the fire had burned down low, casting their shadows long and close together on the wall. At dawn, hoofbeats returned, many this time. James stepped outside before she could stop him. The men from town waited at the gate, rifles across saddles. Fear and shame tangled in their faces. The preacher rode at their head, his voice trembling as he called out, "Sheriff Alder, You're wanted in Red Hollow to answer for last night's violence." "I'll answer," Alder said. "But you'll hear all of it, not just Miller's half." He handed his gun belt to the preacher, turned once toward Clara. Their eyes met across the pale morning. She wanted to run to him, to beg him not to go, but Eli's small hand clutched hers and held her still. Alder rode away, flanked by townsmen, his figure shrinking down the road until it blurred with the horizon. When the last echo of hooves was gone, Clara sank to her knees in the doorway. The air smelled of cold earth and gunpowder, and somewhere in the distance a crow called over the ridge. She pressed her palms together and whispered, "Come back to me." Outside, the creek kept whispering beneath the ice, carrying her words toward the town where justice waited with a fickle hand. The sun climbed slow over Red Hollow, pale and cold, as if it too feared what the day would bring. Clara Wren stood outside her cabin watching the distant road where the sheriff and the men had vanished. The wind lifted her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. Behind her, Eli clung to her skirt, silent. The smell of gunpowder still hung faintly in the air, sharp and metallic. She went inside, shut the door, and dropped the latch. The cabin felt smaller without him there. His coat still hung on the peg, the mark of his boots still pressed into the dirt floor. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold the ache inside, but the feeling only spread. Eli tugged at her sleeve. "Is he coming back, Clara?" She knelt, smoothing his hair. "Yes," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was truth or prayer. "He will come back." He nodded and went to sit by the hearth. She watched him, thinking how quickly a child could believe in promises, and how hard it was for grown people to do the same. Outside, a crow called from the trees, a harsh cry that broke the quiet. Clara set to work without thinking, tidying the table, sweeping the ashes, folding the blanket James had used the night before. Her hands needed something to do. If she stopped moving, her mind would turn to fear. Hours passed. The light shifted from gold to gray. She baked another loaf, not because they needed it, but because she couldn't bear the silence. Every creak of the wind sounded like a horse coming down the road. By evening, her hope began to thin. When night fell, she took down the lantern and set it by the window, leaving it lit. A beacon, small and stubborn. Eli fell asleep curled beneath her shawl. She sat beside the window all night, eyes fixed on the road. At dawn, a single rider appeared. Her breath caught. The figure leaned in the saddle, moving slow. When the horse stopped near the fence, she saw it wasn't James Alder. It was the preacher. His hat was in his hands, his face pale as parchment. She stepped outside before he could dismount. "Where is he?" The preacher's eyes lowered. "They've locked him in the jailhouse, Clara. Judge Caro's coming from Fort Lorne to hold hearing tomorrow. They say it's attempted murder. Miller's alive, but bad off. The town's divided on whether to hang the sheriff or thank him." She gripped the post to steady herself. "They can't hang him for defending himself. They can when the man he shot's calling it cold-blooded. Miller's family's stirring trouble. There's talk of vigilantes if the judge rules light." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her boots. "I have to see him." The preacher hesitated. "They won't let you inside." "Then I'll wait outside the door until they do." He didn't try to stop her. He simply handed her a small folded paper. "He told me to give you this if I came through first." She took it with trembling fingers. The seal was nothing more than a smudge of candle wax. Inside, his handwriting slanted firm and spare. "Clara, don't come to town tonight. There's more danger than you can see. Keep the boy safe. Whatever happens, know that I do not regret a single thing I've done for you. James." She read it twice, then folded it against her chest. "He's wrong," she whispered. "I'm not staying behind." Before sunrise, she saddled her father's old mare, a stubborn animal more bone than strength, but it would carry her. Eli cried when she told him to stay with Mrs. Amos, but she kissed his forehead and said, "I'll be back with him soon, I promise." The road to town cut through fog and frost. Her fingers numbed on the reins, yet she rode harder, faster, her heart hammering with each hoofbeat. By the time Red Hollow appeared through the mist, the streets were already thick with men, farmers, drifters, miners, drawn by the promise of judgment. She dismounted behind the feed store and pulled her shawl low over her hair. The jail stood across from the saloon, 2 windows barred, 1 lantern burning dim inside. She slipped through the alley and came up near the side wall. Through the bars she could see him. James sat on the cot, wrists bound loosely in front of him. His face was bruised but calm, the same steadiness that had drawn her since the first moment they met. When he saw her, his eyes widened with something between relief and fear. "Clara," he said, low but urgent, "you shouldn't be here. I'm not leaving you." He shook his head. "The town's turned mean. They're waiting for the judge to make a show of me. Then we'll make our own show. Clara." Before he could finish, footsteps echoed down the hall. She darted behind the corner as the door opened. Miller entered, arm in a sling, face twisted in hate. "Sheriff," he said, voice slurred with whiskey, "seems Justice has got a short walk today. Judge is due by noon. Folks figure he'll find you guilty. Saves them the trouble of hanging you themselves." James didn't move. "You've had enough blood for 1 week." Miller's mouth curled. "Ain't about blood. It's about pride. You made me look weak. I can't live with that." He drew his pistol. Clara's breath froze. James stood slowly, chains clinking. "You pull that trigger, you prove every word I said about you. That's what you can't stomach." Miller's hand shook. "Maybe I just like the sound it makes." Clara moved before thought could stop her. She came around the corner, voice sharp. "You shoot him, and the whole town will know you're a coward twice over. Once for your lies, and again for killing a man in chains." Miller spun, startled. "You!" James lunged forward, shoulder slamming into him. The gun fired wild, shattering the window. Shouts rose outside. Men rushed toward the noise. "Run!" James barked. "Now!" She grabbed the keys from Miller's belt as he fell, fumbling with them until the lock gave. James caught her hand, dragging her toward the back door. They burst into the alley, smoke curling from the gun barrel, still clutched in her shaking hand. Behind them, the alarm spread. "They're escaping." James yanked her onto the horse, swung up behind, and spurred hard. Bullets cracked against the walls, splintering wood. The mare screamed and leapt forward. They tore through the main street, men scattering. The cold wind burned her eyes. James steered for the river, his arm around her waist, voice shouting over the roar of hooves. "Hold on!" The bridge ahead was half rotten from winter floods, but it was their only way out. The horse hit the planks, hooves drumming. Behind them, riders followed. 5, maybe 6. Halfway across, a shot ripped through the air. The mare stumbled, screamed, and went down. Clara and James were thrown into the icy river. The shock stole her breath. She fought the current, felt his hand catch hers, pulling her toward the far bank. They crawled out, soaked and shivering, lungs burning. Behind them, the men on horseback searched the opposite shore, shouting, but the fog swallowed everything. They hid among the reeds until the noise faded. James pushed wet hair from his face and looked at her. "You could have been killed." "You would have been," she said fiercely. He stared at her, then laughed once, broken, incredulous. "You're mad." "Maybe," she said, "but you're alive." They found an abandoned line shack half a mile upriver. He built a fire from damp wood, coaxing the smoke into warmth. She stripped off her soaked shawl and wrapped it near the flames. For a while, neither spoke. The firelight threw their shadows against the rough boards, trembling with the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "You could have left me there." "I couldn't." "You don't owe me anything." "I know." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "But I owe myself the truth. You're the first person who's ever seen me for more than what this town whispers." He reached across the small space, brushing his fingers over hers. "I saw you the moment you walked in with that bread," he said. "Didn't know what it meant then. I do now." She felt the warmth of his touch sink through the cold. "And what does it mean?" "That I'd follow you through hell itself." Outside, the storm began to rise again, snow turning to sleet that hissed against the roof. She leaned against him, exhaustion pulling at her bones. For a moment, they allowed themselves the comfort of stillness. But peace in the west never lasted. By dawn, riders had crossed the river. They would have to move again. James saddled the mare's replacement, a thin gray gelding from the shack's stable. Before they left, he turned to her. "If they catch us, tell them you were forced. Tell them you didn't know." She shook her head. "Don't ask me to lie. Not after all the truth we fought for." He smiled faintly. "Didn't think you would." They rode through the fog toward the mountains, the town fading behind them like a memory. The air grew colder, cleaner. Above them, the peaks caught the first edge of sunlight. Clara looked back once. Smoke rose faintly from Red Hollow, curling into the pale sky. Somewhere in that smoke was every life she'd ever known. Her father's bakery, the whispers, the hunger, the ache of being alone. Ahead of her rode the only man who had ever stood beside her when the world turned cruel. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like running. She felt like living. James turned in the saddle, his profile cut against the dawn. "Where to?" She smiled through the breath that fogged in the cold. "Anywhere the law can't find us. Then, we'll start there." He reached out his hand. She took it. Their fingers twined, firm as a vow. Behind them, the rising sun spilled light over the valley, and Red Hollow shrank to a shadow at the edge of the plains. Ahead lay open land, and the thin road of mercy they'd carved with courage and desperation. The wind caught her hair and flung it back, and for a heartbeat she felt the weight of every mile she'd survived lift away. Whatever waited beyond the next ridge, danger, redemption, or peace, she knew this. She would not face it alone. And somewhere behind them, in the cold morning air, the smell of bread still lingered faintly, sweet and defiant, like the memory of a promise kept. In the vast silence of the frontier, where law and love often stood on opposite sides of the same road, Clara Wren and Sheriff James Alder proved that the heart could still choose mercy. From the last loaf of bread to the last bullet fired in Red Hollow, theirs became a story of courage, redemption, and a love strong enough to outlast the dust of the West. Even when the world turned against them, they chose each other, and in that choice, they found their freedom. If you were moved by Clara and James's journey through the wild heart of Red Hollow, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale brings you passion, sacrifice, and timeless romance from the rugged frontier. Hit that subscribe button and ride with us through more unforgettable stories of love that defies the desert wind.